imagine, just for a second, that you are sitting in the middle of a massive, just soul-crushing traffic jam.
Oh, we all know that exact feeling.
Right. You know the exact kind I'm talking about. The red brake lights are just stretching out for miles ahead of you like this glowing river. Maybe the rain is pouring down in sheets. Your windshield wipers are making that relentless squeaking sound, and you are just feeling utterly exhausted from the daily grind.
Your shoulders are tight, your jaw is clenched.
Exactly. Or, maybe for you it's not a car. Maybe you are standing in a smoke-filled kitchen. You're trying to cook dinner after a 12-hour shift. The kids are screaming in the other room. The pan on the stove is burning. The fire alarm is blaring. And you are just at the absolute end of your rope.
You're physically there, but mentally you are just trying to survive the next 10 seconds.
Yeah, you're trapped in that space. Now, I want you to hold on to that feeling for a moment. Because what if I told you that exact frustrating, overwhelming, sensory overload moment could become a sacred sanctuary?
It sounds impossible.
Right. What if you didn't need to escape that chaotic physical space to find absolute transcendent peace or even supernatural power?
It is a profoundly counterintuitive premise,
Mm.
and it really gets right to the very heart of what we're going to be exploring today. We are taking a deep dive into an absolutely fascinating collection of research.
And what a stack of material it is.
It really is. We are looking at a stack of theological research notes, historical book excerpts, and even highly detailed script instructions for a pastoral documentary.
Mm.
All of this material is centered around a comprehensive theological framework developed by Pastor Chang,
Which he titled The Sanctuary of Time.
right, or in the original Chinese.
We are talking about a deep synthesis of some incredibly complex, contrasting thinkers here. I mean, on one side of the ring, we have the legendary rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He views the Sabbath as this deeply philosophical, untouchable palace in time.
A beautiful concept.
Absolutely beautiful. And then, completely on the other end of the theological spectrum, we have Dr. Rennie McLean, a charismatic Christian voice who explores the concept of supernatural portals and what he calls eternity invading time.
Precisely. So our mission today is to take these deep theological arguments, unpack them, and synthesize them for you. We're going to explore this profound, almost uncomfortable tension between seeking spiritual peace.
Which is the ultimate goal in Heschel's paradigm.
Right, seeking peace versus seeking supernatural power, which is the ultimate goal in McLean's paradigm. And through this exploration, we will discover Pastor Du's missing key that bridges these two seemingly opposite goals.
And that key is the absolute unyielding sovereignty of the Holy Spirit.
Exactly.
But before we really jump into the deep end, I have to mention something incredibly unique about the material we're working with today. The notes actually include direct, explicit instructions for a pastoral theological documentary based on Pastor Du's teachings.
They do, which is quite unusual for this kind of theological research.
Very unusual. And to really honor the intent of the author, we are going to structure our deep dive today using that exact logical documentary arc. So we are going to move systematically through 4 distinct acts: the intro, the deep dive, the application, and the conclusion.
That is right. And the author's notes for this documentary don't just dictate the structural arc, they also include incredibly specific, unbending visual branding instructions.
I love this part.
It's so specific. The notes explicitly state that all on-screen text in this documentary must be presented in a solid, bold font with absolutely no text shadow.
No text shadow at all.
None. Furthermore, there must be a watermark reading copyright Chang /3-in-1, and that is specifically with a lowercase in for the word in running continuously throughout the entire video.
I just picture that watermark floating in my mind's eye right now as we talk. Just imagine it hovering right there in the corner of your vision. Copyright Chang /3-in-1, lowercase in.
It frames the whole discussion.
It does. And that instruction about the solid, bold font with no text shadow, I feel like that is almost a theological statement in itself. It's bold, it's solid, there are no shadows, no hidden meanings, just absolute clarity. So, keeping that highly specific, solid, bold visual in our minds, let's transition into part 1 of our deep dive.
The tyranny of space versus the architecture of time.
Yes, this is where we introduce Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I have to say, even outside of his theology, what an incredible cinematic life this man lived.
Truly an extraordinary life, and one deeply embedded in the historical trauma and triumphs of the 20th century. Abraham Joshua Heschel was arguably one of the premier Jewish thinkers of his era.
And his background is so layered.
It really is. He grew up enveloped in the deeply religious, mystical Hasidic community of Warsaw. Later, he explored secular, cultural Jewish life in Vilna and eventually pursued his doctorate in a highly cosmopolitan, yet increasingly dangerous and hostile Berlin.
Right during the rise of the Third Reich.
Exactly. He narrowly managed to escape Nazi-dominated Berlin, eventually securing a visa that allowed him to emigrate to the United States.
And once he got here, he didn't just write theology from the safety of an ivory tower. He was a man out in the streets. He was a vocal, militant voice for nonviolent social action.
Very active.
He famously marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma. He was a staunch public opponent of the Vietnam War, and he even participated in the Second Vatican Council.
Which was huge. He played a pivotal role in helping to reverse long-standing, historically damaging Catholic Church doctrine regarding the Jewish people.
We are looking at a man who was deeply physically engaged in the major political and historical events of his time. However, for the purposes of our deep dive today, we are going to focus strictly on his theological philosophy, specifically his views on time and space.
And to understand that philosophy, we really have to understand the profound internal tension that drove him. Heschel famously wrote that his mind was constantly torn between two great opposing Jewish traditions.
Okay, what were they?
On one hand, his heart resonated with the deep compassion, the mystical joy, and the love for the common people taught by the Hasidic Baal Shem Tov. But on the other hand, his intellect was captured by the cruel, uncompromising, absolute demands for truth championed by the Kotzker Rebbe.
So you have a mind trying to reconcile radical compassion with radical truth. How does that tension manifest in his view of the Sabbath?
It manifests beautifully in his classic book, The Sabbath. The core of his argument in that text is a blistering critique of modern technical civilization. He argues that humanity has become entirely obsessed with what he calls the conquest of space.
And just to clarify for everyone, when Heschel talks about space, he's not talking about outer space.
No, not astronauts and rockets.
Right. He means the material world, the physical, three-dimensional realm. He associates the realm of space with thinghood, the insatiable human drive to build, to acquire, to amass wealth, to conquer territory, and to manage the forces of nature.
The things we can touch, the things we can put our names on. And he argues that this infatuation with the splendor of space leads directly to a tragic condition he calls the loss of inner liberty.
Loss of inner liberty?
Yes. We become so obsessed with our things, with controlling our physical environment, that we actually, ironically, turn into tools for our own possessions. There is a quote from his writings in the source material that just hits so hard for a modern listener. He says, "Life goes wrong when the control of space, the acquisition of things of space, becomes our sole concern."
It is a profound diagnosis of the modern human condition. Think about your own life for a second. You think you own your car, your house, your high-end smartphone, but really, if you step back and look at it, they own you.
You are serving them.
You have to work extra hours to maintain them. You have to buy insurance for them. You lose sleep worrying about them breaking down. You spend your weekends cleaning them and organizing them. You become completely enslaved to the spatial realm. You are a servant to your things.
Exactly. Heschel points out the tragic irony that we willingly expend the finite hours of our lives to gain infinite space. We sacrifice the dimension of time, which he beautifully calls the heart of existence, just to get more physical stuff.
It's so backwards when you frame it like that.
It is. And in stark contrast to this modern space religion, Heschel presents Judaism as a religion of time. And he points to a radical departure in the biblical creation story compared to other ancient Near Eastern religions.
Yes, this part is fascinating, because in most ancient religions, the gods make a physical place holy. A mountain, a river, a specific grove of trees.
A golden shrine, a stone altar.
Right. But in Genesis, the very first thing that the Creator made holy wasn't a physical object at all. It was a segment of time. The seventh day, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy.
So the question becomes, how does Heschel suggest we interact with this holy segment of time? Because if it's just a day on the calendar, we just cross it off like anything else.
Yeah, how do you inhabit a day?
This is where he introduces this incredible concept of the Sabbath as a palace in time, or an architecture of time. Since you cannot build the Sabbath out of bricks or mortar or wood, you have to build it through intentional actions and deliberate abstentions. And the ultimate goal of stepping into this temporal palace is to achieve a state he calls menuya.
Menuyiha, that's a Hebrew word, right?
Yes, menuya is a deeply rich, nuanced Hebrew concept. It translates roughly to perfect rest, harmony, tranquility, and peace. But it is much deeper than just taking a break. It's a profound, conscious harmony between humanity and the world, between the soul and its creator. Heschel is incredibly careful to distinguish minuia from the classical Greek or Aristotelian idea of rest.
Right, because Aristotle viewed rest simply as a necessary biological break. You work, you get tired, you rest to recover your physical energy, and then you go right back to work. It was purely utilitarian.
Exactly. The Aristotelian view is relaxing for the sake of future activity.
Like plugging your smartphone into the charger at night, you don't plug it in because the phone enjoys being plugged in. You plug it in so the battery is at 100% the next morning so you can drain it all over again.
That's a perfect modern analogy.
Heschel says no, that is absolutely not what the Sabbath is. He writes, labor is a craft, but perfect rest is an art. Perfect rest isn't just taking a nap on the couch. It is a deliberate, fiercely positive action of entering into the felt presence of God.
It is an intentional, disciplined abstention from the world of commerce, technology, and manipulation. When you step into minuah, you are not just pausing your life, you are actively participating in eternity.
To illustrate what this active, joyful participation actually looks like, the research notes include a wonderful rabbinic midrash, a traditional Jewish story. It is the story of Rabbi Shimeon and the old man with the myrtle branches.
It's a beautiful story.
According to the midrash, Rabbi Shimeon and a few others were sitting together, engaged in a discussion about the great civilizational works of the Romans. They were marveling at the Roman roads, their massive stone bridges, their luxurious bathhouses.
Which are the ultimate achievements in the realm of space, right?
Right.
The Romans were the absolute masters of conquering and building in the physical world.
Exactly. They were discussing the pinnacle of spatial conquest. But then, as the sun began to set and the Sabbath was approaching at twilight, they saw an old man running swiftly past them, and in his hands he was holding 2 bundles of myrtle branches.
No, wait, let me just clarify the myrtle branches for a second. Why those specifically?
Yeah, that's a great point. Myrtle branches were deeply symbolic in that culture, traditionally used for weddings. They symbolized deep love, joy, and beauty, and it was customary for grooms to carry them to enthusiastically welcome their bride. So when Rabbi Shimeon stopped the old man and asked why he was carrying them, the old man replied that it was to honor the Sabbath. He held one branch for the biblical commandment to remember the Sabbath day, and the second branch for the commandment to observe or guard it.
So he isn't just getting ready for a day off, he is preparing for a wedding.
Yes. For Rabbi Shimeon, seeing this old man treating the approaching segment of time with the passionate zeal, the joy, and a romantic preparation of a groom rushing to meet his bride, the Sabbath bride, was a profound, paradigm-shifting revelation.
It brought an immediate tranquility to his soul.
It showed him, in real time, that the answer to the overwhelming, crushing machinery of Roman civilization wasn't to just flee from it or try to outbuild it, but to find a destiny that transcends it entirely by elevating time.
It is a staggeringly gorgeous image, the idea of running to meet time like a lover, rather than running away from time like a taskmaster. But, as with any deep theological or philosophical framework, we cannot just accept it at face value. We have to look at it critically from multiple angles.
Right. And our research notes provide some rigorous critiques of Heschel's paradigm to ensure we have a fully balanced representation of the theological landscape.
Indeed, theologians like Timothy Watson and Carmen Imes raise important scholarly counterpoints to Heschel's almost exclusive elevation of time. Watson, for instance, takes a much closer exegetical look at the Genesis 2 text.
What does he find?
He points out that the text explicitly states God blessed and sanctified the seventh day because he had completed his work and rested. Watson argues that the focus of the biblical text is on God's completion, his satisfaction, and his celebration of the created work, not necessarily on establishing a rigid philosophical hierarchy where the dimension of time is inherently superior to the dimension of space.
That makes a lot of sense, and Imes has an even more practical point, right? If you read the Old Testament, it is absolutely obsessed with physical space.
It really is.
You have the promise of a specific physical piece of land. You have the detailed, agonizingly precise architectural instructions for the tabernacle. You have the grand temple in Jerusalem, where the literal presence of God was said to dwell in a physical room.
And Imes suggests that Heschel's heavy, almost exclusive focus on time over space might not be purely biblical, but deeply influenced by his own historical trauma and context as a diaspora Jew.
It is a vital and deeply empathetic critique. She notes that Heschel was writing after centuries of exile and immediately following the Holocaust. The physical spaces that God had historically made holy for Israel were largely unavailable to him, or had been sites of unimaginable trauma.
Therefore, constructing a palace in time becomes a movable, indestructible sanctuary for a people who have been violently separated from their physical land.
So she's saying that the architecture of time is a brilliant survival mechanism, but it might miss the fact that God actually does care deeply about the physical world.
Precisely. It reminds us that while Heschel's philosophy is incredibly poetic, intellectually satisfying, and spiritually enriching, taking it to an absolute extreme where physical space is entirely divested of divine value might miss some of the earthy, material nuance of the biblical narrative.
But his core warning that we are constantly at risk of being tyrannized by the material world and losing our inner liberty remains incredibly potent.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Heschel gives us this beautiful framework for finding profound peace and manuha by retreating from the physical world. But let's be honest for a second. Think about your life. What if you don't just need a quiet moment of peace?
Sometimes peace isn't enough.
Exactly. What if you are staring down the barrel of a bankruptcy? What if you just got a terrifying medical diagnosis? What if your marriage is falling apart in real time? Sometimes stepping into a palace in time just isn't going to cut it. Sometimes you need a literal physical miracle in your physical space right now.
And that brings us to part 2 of our deep dive, eternity invading time.
This is where we shift paradigms completely and introduce the work of Dr. Rennie McLean. We are moving from a highly academic Jewish philosopher writing in the mid-20th century to a contemporary charismatic Christian voice of Jamaican and Jewish descent.
Dr. McLean brings a completely different lens to the intersection of the eternal and the temporal. According to the biographical notes in our research, McLean experienced vivid angelic visitations from a very young age.
Which obviously shapes a person's entire reality.
Completely. These experiences deeply shaped his worldview and culminated in what he describes as a divine mandate to teach the body of believers about the reality of the supernatural. His theology is heavily, almost exclusively, focused on what he calls biblical portals and the audacious concept that eternity can literally, tangibly invade our earthly timeline.
What's fascinating here is how Heschel and McLean both stare at the exact same intersection, the meeting point between God's eternal nature and our human timeline, but they walk away with entirely different, almost opposing objectives.
The whole opposites.
Heschel explicitly and categorically rejects using religion as a magical tool to manipulate the physical order. For Heschel, trying to use God to change your physical circumstances is slipping right back into the tyranny of space. He simply wants communion and peace with God. McLean, on the other hand, teaches that seeking supernatural manifestation to actively alter physical reality is the very right and responsibility of the believer.
So for McLean, the goal isn't just to rest in God's presence, it is to pull God's power down to fix the broken physical world. He teaches that when eternity invades time, believers enter what he calls a timeless zone. And this isn't just a metaphor for him.
No, it's very literal.
He argues that in this eternal zone, the natural laws of time and physics lose their grip on the earth. Believers are granted the divine authority to actually speak to physical matter, and that matter is obligated to obey.
The research quotes McLean explicitly stating that in these open windows to heaven, believers can retrieve supernatural favor, physical healings, and miraculous financial provision. It is entirely about unlocking tangible miracles. And just as their goals are completely different, their methods are entirely contrasting.
Right. Heschel's method is intentional abstention. You stop working, you pull back, you light the candles, you say the prayers, you rest. McLean's method, however, is what he terms aggressive faith, or faith in the now.
McLean strongly emphasizes that faith is not a passive waiting game. It is not sitting back and hoping God does something. It is an active, aggressive, spiritually violent response to God's set times.
And to ground this biblically, he points heavily to the Jewish feasts outlined in Leviticus chapter 23.
Walk me through that. Why Leviticus 23? Those are the ancient agricultural festivals, right? Passover, Pentecost, the Feast of Tabernacles. How do those connect to aggressive faith and portals?
McLean views these feasts not just as historical memorials or agricultural celebrations, but as literal divine appointments. The Hebrew word for these feasts is modim, which means appointed times. In McLean's theology, these appointed times are specific calendrical windows where the portal between the heavenly dimension and the earthly dimension is thrown wide open.
So the barrier gets thin.
Exactly. During these specific windows, the barrier between eternity and time is thinnest.
So it is almost like a cosmic alignment. He's saying that if you know when the portal is open, you don't just sit there and enjoy the breeze.
Precisely. Instead of resting from the world, McLean teaches that believers must actively use prophetic insight during these open portals to pull heavenly realities, the miracles, the signs, the wonders down into their current, desperate earthly circumstances. It is a highly offensive rather than defensive spiritual posture.
Okay, so we have this massive, almost uncomfortable tension between these two paradigms. Heschel is saying, step away from the physical world, build a palace in time, cease your striving, and find perfect, beautiful peace. McLean is saying, no, step into a timeless portal, use aggressive, demanding faith, and pull down supernatural power to drastically change your physical world.
They really do feel mutually exclusive.
You are either retreating to find peace or you are aggressively warring to find power. How can you possibly do both?
Which brings us precisely to the turning point of our documentary structure. Part 3 of our deep dive, Pastor Chang Du's synthesis. This is the absolute heart of the framework we are exploring today.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Pastor Du looks at these two massive paradigms, Heschel's deeply philosophical pursuit of peace and McLean's aggressive pursuit of supernatural power. And he identifies a profound theological bridge that resolves the tension entirely.
Because Pastor Du doesn't take the easy way out. He doesn't say Heschel is right and McLean is wrong, or vice versa. He synthesizes them using a core thesis that honestly takes a minute to wrap your head around. Let's look at his exact formulation from the documentary notes.
The central thesis of Pastor Du's framework, originally written in Chinese, is this, and I'll read the translation here. God's eternity enters human time, sharing God's own rest. Humans participate in God's eternity through rest in time.
Okay, hold on. That is incredibly dense. Humans participate in God's eternity through rest in time. Break that down for me. How do I, as a person living in the 21st century, actually do that on a random Tuesday afternoon?
Think of it like tuning a radio to a specific frequency. God's eternity, His power, His miracles, that is the radio signal broadcasting constantly. Heschel recognized that to hear the signal, you have to turn off the static of the world. You have to rest.
Okay, I follow that.
McLean recognized that the signal carries actual world-changing power. Pastor Du connects them by saying that rest is the actual mechanism by which you receive the power. You don't get the power by screaming louder, you get the power by matching the frequency of heaven, which is perfect rest.
I see.
But to achieve this, Pastor Du says we first have to dismantle something he calls spatial religion.
Spatial religion. This is where Pastor Du really starts turning the screws. Because he agrees with Heschel that humanity has distorted the Sabbath. But instead of just focusing on our obsession with acquiring material things, Pastor Du points out how we have taken the concept of encountering God and locked it inside a spatial cage.
We box it in.
We have created this deeply ingrained false belief that to find God, or to experience His power, or to find His peace, you have to travel to a highly specific physical location.
It is the human desire to contain and control the divine.
Yes. The research notes bring up a perfect modern example, the movie War Room.
Oh, right, the film.
Yeah, it's a popular Christian film, but its central premise is that the main character creates a very specific physical closet in her house entirely dedicated to prayer. The implication, whether intentional or not, is that this specific physical space is where the spiritual warfare actually happens.
Or think about the idea that you have to travel to a designated prayer mountain, or that you have to sit in a grand, architecturally stunning cathedral with stained glass windows to truly hear the voice of God.
And Pastor Du points out that even the observance of the Sabbath itself, which Heschel so beautifully called a palace in time, became, over the centuries, a spatial and mechanical cage. The notes mention a fascinating modern phenomenon, Sabbath elevators.
This is a perfect example of the spatial cage.
In certain cities with high populations of observant Jews, elevators in high-rise buildings are mechanically programmed to automatically stop on every single floor during the Sabbath. Why? So that an observant individual does not have to engage in the physical work of pushing a button, which would violate the spatial and mechanical rules of the day.
Think about your own life. Have you ever felt a deep sense of guilt because you could not make it to a specific church building on a Sunday morning? Maybe you were sick or you had to work and you felt like you entirely missed out on God for the entire week because you weren't in the right room.
That guilt, that is exactly the spatial cage Pastor Du is talking about. We think God is stuck in the building.
It is the ultimate spiritual irony. In a desperate attempt to protect the Sabbath rest, humanity created a rigid, exhausting, highly technical system of physical rules. They held fiercely onto the calendar, the scrolls, the physical temple, the right rooms, and the right postures. But they were entirely blind to the reality of what the Sabbath